But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Richard Seymour, who is the author of many, many books, but most recently, Disaster Nationalism, the Downfall of Liberal Civilization. Thanks for joining us, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
I guess just to begin with, what is disaster nationalism?
Well, it's a word or a term that I've come up with to describe a new form of far-right politics that isn't yet fascist, but it's incipiently fascist. It's moving in that direction, perhaps more rapidly now than previously. The reason I'm calling it disaster nationalism, apart from the riff on Naomi Klein's term, disaster capitalism, is that I had noticed a few years ago, I think actually this goes back to the Tea Party, that this new right is obsessed with images of disaster and meltdown and everything falling apart. You can see this beginning with the fear that Obama's Medicare reforms would result in death panels. And then the idea that he wasn't really a true American anyway. He's some Kenyan, anti-colonial Kenyan, and a socialist and all of this stuff. And then Great Replacement theory and white genocide. And then the idea that COVID-19 is a plot against the people to implement a Fourth Reich. We had wildfires in America that they were blamed on Antifa, setting fires in order to murder all the white conservative Christians in rural areas, all of this sort of stuff. And it struck me that when we live in a world that is not short on real disasters, I mean, we're all living through it, not just the natural disasters, so-called wildfires and earthquakes and storms and flooding and all the rest of it, but recession, war, obviously pandemic. We're living in a world where people are having to assimilate a lot of really overwhelming disasters, threatening, at times appearing to threaten social collapse. I mean, certainly that was the risk with the pandemic, hence the need for radical non-pharmaceutical interventions and so on. I wondered what that was about. Why, given the real disasters that we face, are they obsessed with and motivated by, animated by these imaginary scenarios of, extreme erotic evil, sexual evil, like global predators, pedophiles working in Hollywood, in the White House, in pizza parlors, and so on. And one of the conclusions that I came to after looking through a lot of this material is that this is a way of assimilating the real disasters in people's lives, which can be both acute and general, or they can be chronic and they can be experienced at a very individual level. Like, for example, in Oregon, in the state of Oregon, where they had wildfires in 2020, and these conspiracy theories came out that it was Antifa that was setting the fires. For years, those people have been going through something of a social disaster. Rising poverty, deaths of despair, suicide, addiction, worst addiction rates in America, and this is before the fentanyl crisis. And this is a way of assimilating a disaster and giving you something to do about it. So usually when people are confronted with disasters, especially, acute disasters in their lives, what happens is people shut down and sometimes they turn on one another. So it's not particularly animating. It can be a source of depression and psychological concussion. And instead, what disaster nationalism gives you is something that's really thrilling and exciting, which is the idea that somebody specific is threatening you. So it's not abstract. It's not a system. It's not something that's hard to get your hands around. It gives you an enemy that you can kill. You can't shoot capitalism. You can't shoot climate change, but you can hunt down Antifa with guns. You can set up armed checkpoints, and then you can march on the cities, and you can threaten the Black Lives Matter protesters, and then you can march to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and you can try and round up all the people, the communists that you say are in charge, and string them up. And of course, this doesn't really solve any of the problems, but like any symptom, it's not supposed to solve the problem. It's a kind of conservative response, a conservative insurgent response to real chaos, real disasters. Crucial thing to say about this, though, is that there's often an idea that the people who are most likely to vote for this new far right or to organize for them are somehow the left behind. And this is a howl of inchoate rage on the part of those who have been abandoned. There's very little evidence for that. By and large, the support for these far-right parties and leaderships and election campaigns begins with the middle class, the posher end of town, and it then builds a cross-class coalition. What they do tend to have in common, the people who align behind this politics, is there's a strong trend for them to have experienced trajectories of relative decline in their lives. So they may not be poor. They may, in fact, many of them be particularly well off compared to most of the population, but they will have experienced some sort of crisis and decline. That was true of a lot of the so-called insurrectionists. If you remember back in, I think it was February 2021, where they marched on the Capitol, there was research done on this by Robert Pape, and basically found that apart from a few ex-military people who knew about weapons and violence, a lot of them were businessmen and women, people who had done extremely well out of the boom, and then they had experienced bankruptcies, losses. And if you sort of compound these kinds of losses with the kinds of personal problems that people face, like maybe losing your job, so failure, or divorce, and another kind of failure that's particularly toxic for older men, then you can see how this substrate of vengeful emotion can be built up. So there's the desire for revenge, to make somebody pay for this, to make somebody feel what I'm feeling. And that's what this form of politics gives you. So in some ways, it's continuous with interwar fascism. It has some similarities, but in various ways, it's a very distinct, very novel phenomenon.
Richard, nationalism, in the minds of some at least, has often been associated with a whole range of disastrous consequences. What distinguishes this disaster nationalism from previous articulations? Well,
first of all, let's just stress the similarities. I mean, if you go back and look at the record of interwar fascism and the build-up, you see quite a lot of people responding to disasters, real disasters, World War I, the Great Depression, 1929. And one thing that's different between now and then, though, is that there was an organized communist movement internationally. And it was possible then for fascism to semi-realistically, albeit within a strongly paranoid conspiracist framework, blame communism for all of these problems. And basically behind communism, of course, they blamed the Jews. So the Judeo-Bolshevism is causing these problems for our people. So that's a line of continuity. What's different here today is that there is a very thin civic society base. That's the first thing. So interwar fascism was very well grounded in veterans associations, cooperative civil society groups, etc. You don't have that sort of thing today. Today it's very much more atomized, and it's based on networked forms of organization where people are organized on the basis of associations on social media platforms. And you can see this in the way that, for example, Rodrigo Duterte or Jair Bolsonaro would use troll farms to orchestrate waves of public opinion, but more importantly, waves of incitement, harassment, death threats. They would give you an enemy and they would set you off after them. Another important difference, I think, is that today's far right doesn't really have a utopian horizon. Interwar fascism clearly had the idea that we are going to radically revolutionize society. Now, the extent to which they actually did so, it's much less than what they said they were going to do. They had promised some kind of confrontation with capitalism, and that didn't happen. But their main objective at that point was to reform the system and to spiritualize class relations. So not to overthrow class, but to renationalize the working class, as it were. Today, there's no kind of idea of class transcendence. There's no idea that we're going to mitigate the severities of capitalism. Quite the opposite. The argument is that capitalism has been held back by woke, fluffy, politically correct constraints for too long. And that's why we're losing, and that's why the wrong people are winning. So beyond that, of course, interwar fascism had a colonial ideology. We can build better living conditions for our people by colonizing Eastern Europe and Russia and enslaving those whom we allowed to survive. And Germans, for example, will have much better living standards. That was a utopian idea. Horrible, horrible utopian idea, but that's how it functioned. There's no such thing today. I mean, there's very little in the way of any kind of material substratum, in terms of improving people's lives, let alone any utopian horizon. At most, there's a kind of defensive nationalist horizon. We're going to keep out the bad people. We're going to keep out the drugs. We're going to keep out competition from foreign workers and trade and so on. As it stands, the only real gesture towards any kind of material offer to the voters for that kind of politics is coming from the United States now. We're going to reorganize global trade in a radical way, and that's going to cause manufacturing to come back, and people will have secure jobs and better wages. I mean, I think this is a complete fantasy. I think it doesn't even have a real foundation, any kind of realistic strategy of capital accumulation, but that's the extent of their material promise. So there's something about this form of far-right politics that is deeply nihilistic. It's much, much more about revenge and the thrill of destruction than it is about any kind of utopian reconstruction, and much more simulacral. I mean, this is really important. Quite a lot of today's politics is conducted in terms of consensual hallucination. So QAnon, for example, is a phenomenon based on a live-action role-playing game where people agree to participate in what is essentially a fiction and a series of ideas for which they have no evidence, based on a few MacGuffins dropped by someone called Q, who basically post these oracular statements, and they try to make sense of it and build this elaborate, inchoately fascist worldview out of it. And it's almost as if at that point, there's no real idea of, let's say, an agency for social transformation. There's the idea that the good guys in power, in the case of QAnon, it would be the guys around Donald Trump, are going to rescue us. They're working to fight the bad guys. But more fundamentally, there's a kind of pseudo-Gnostic idea that we live in a simulated reality, that everything we've been told is wrong, that Obama didn't have an American birth certificate, that COVID wasn't a real virus, that the moon landing didn't happen, that the Holocaust didn't happen. So there's a sense that ultimately, through a violent rupture, by rounding up all the lefties and the Hollywood liberals and the Democrats and having them shot or sent to Guantanamo Bay, we can break through this fake reality and experience some true reality beyond it. That's a little bit different from what we've had before. So there's many ways in which it's different, but I mean, and I'll just say, finish on this point, I think the most fundamental and important difference is the difference that pertains to the, if you like, the stage of capitalist development. today's far right corresponds to the neoliberal reconstruction of capitalism since the 70s. Today's far right parties have internalized neoliberal ideas and predicates. They're often critical of the institutions of neoliberalism, like NAFTA or the European Union. But they are broadly on board for neoliberalism's critique of the idea of society. They're strongly sociophobic. They're strongly on board for the critique of welfare and democracy. And in fact, whereas the interwar far right was given to idolize the state, a kind of idolatry, today's far right certainly supports the repressive apparatuses, the police and what have you, but is extremely averse to the point of paranoid to the state's welfare and health functions, and regards those as the basis for a kind of nascent totalitarianism. So those are some of the contrasts that I can see.
Richard, in this post-consensus world where so many people are living in different information realities, it strikes me that one of the issues leading to that is that institutions like the Fourth Estate have lost a lot of credibility. When you speak of there being these information systems that say climate change isn't real, this isn't real, that isn't real, they have as much credibility in the eye of the average person as the institutions which say all of these things are real, or which say things that are actually happening. How do we return to a consensus?
I don't think the idea should be to return to a consensus. And I think one of the big mistakes of liberal politics, in particular over the last decade or so, has been the idea that we can analyze this in terms of post-truth and in terms of disinformation. And there's an argument, well, if we can't agree on the facts, how can we have a democracy? And I would say one of the fundamental things about a democracy is that people don't agree on the facts. Go back to the Iraq War. Did we all agree on whether Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction? Because if we did, then we would have lined up behind the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Bush administration, the Blair administration, and we would have bought into a lie. So there has to be an entitlement to dispute facts and to reason and theorize and investigate things for ourselves. I would say that the question is, how did these, frankly, politically ambiguous subcultures of DIY investigation and conspiracism, which I remember in the late 90s and early 2000s, had a certain ambivalent, ambiguous opening to the other alien conspiracy theories. Do you want to see the aliens or don't you? It wasn't straightforward that it was a kind of xenophobic thing. And it could often feed into the anti-capitalist or anti-war movements, again, in a politically ambiguous way. The question is, how is that then, let's say, metabolized and leveraged and weaponized for far-right cyber war? Because very quickly you see from around 2008, and particularly with the very strong success of the social industry platforms, you see far-right internet sites, publications, micro-celebrities and so on emerge very strongly and learning the ropes very quickly about how to orchestrate these waves of sentiment and fascination on social industry platforms. One of the things about these platforms is that they're always geared towards the next crescendo, the next climax. Everybody's talking about this. Everybody feels the same way about that. Everybody's hashtagging this. And the far-right activists and leaderships and micro-celebrities learned how to leverage that. Actually, I think if you look at it historically, ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, was the first to really max out that strategy. And they used it extremely effectively for recruitment and for building support. So the question is, how were they able to do that? And why did they particularly turn out to be more effective at that? But then another question is, why do people need to believe this stuff? I mean, take, for example, the idea of bathroom predators, which is promoted by the far right and by transphobes of various kinds. All of this stuff has been advanced in anticipation of, well in advance of any evidence of a single example of a bathroom predator of the kind that they're talking about, let alone a trend that could then be analyzed and thought about. So if you're willing to participate in a fantasy, and let's be honest, an erotic fantasy, about something for which you've been given no evidence, no persuasive evidence to believe that that's real, then you're not just a victim of online disinformation. You're not just lacking in media sophistication, or literacy, as they put it. You want to believe in that in some way. And I think that's the real nub of the problem. A lot of people today are finding that their grandparents and their parents, their elderly parents, are going on Facebook and coming away believing a lot of nonsense. Water will give you cancer, and the royals have alien babies and that kind of thing. To some extent, they are being manipulated. To some extent, they are being gulled by sources that look like official news articles. But also, to some extent, this is the kind of stuff that thrills them, that they would like to believe in. And I think one of the things about conspiracy theory is that in a fairly exhausted age, where history seems to have involuted and turned in on itself, where the possibilities seem to have collapsed, and where there isn't really that much to get excited about. And indeed, all we can see is the horizon ahead of us of perpetually worsening climate change and ecological disaster and growing scarcities and supply shocks and no doubt more pandemics and things like that. In that context, what conspiracism does offer is it suggests latent possibilities in the world, thrilling possibilities that you might not have been aware of. It suggests that the world is a lot more opaque than it seems to be, and that to really understand the world, you have to engage in a kind of critical reading. And so what these conspiracy theories often end up doing is performing a symptomatic reading of media discourse and saying, this doesn't add up, that doesn't add up, and then they fabulate their own narrative. Now, this is a paranoid version of, if you like, critical theory. And it's what emerges, I would suggest, when you don't have the kind of international social movement of a kind that communism represented, that is founded in a real sense of agency. In the case of communism, talking about the working class and political parties and trade unions and so on, and linked to a set of conceptualizations, basically a broad set of ideas about how society works and how ideology works and how politics works and what we can do about it. Given the collapse of all that, given the fact that no alternative has yet resurfaced at a sufficiently compelling level and with sufficient social depth, it's not surprising that a lot more people than used to be are open to that kind of invitation, sort of amateurish DIY sleuthing. It gives you a sense of efficacy and agency that we're all lacking in this world. Incidentally, I would also say the same about a lot of this incel stuff. As vicious and toxic as it is, a large part of it is a masculinist response to the problem of inefficacy and paralysis. And I don't just mean, I'll just finish on this, I don't just mean that the political system has shut us down, that we have lost political options, that we're marginalized by real power and so on. I also mean that there's something about the way in which late capitalism works that doesn't give us much to desire, that doesn't give us much to hope for. And Will Davies writes about this in his book on the happiness industry and contemporary forms of depression. And one of the points he makes is that contemporary depression isn't like the sort of traditional neurotic depression of I've got these conflicts and I don't know what to do about them and they shut me down and they make me feel depressed. Rather, it's about the collapse of desire. It's the inability to desire, to even know what it is I should want, let alone know how I would even begin to go about getting it. And that's partly due to a collapse of a shared fantasy. So, I mean, when you talk about consensus, I would talk about shared fantasies. So we shouldn't necessarily try to reach a consensus over the facts, but there has to be some sort of fantasy of who we are, what binds us together. And on that basis, we can then disagree about the facts.
Richard, you discuss disaster nationalism in a range of national political contexts, including, of course, the US, but also elsewhere. What have you noticed about the ways in which, or the different ways in which it manifests? And what, if anything, have you identified as being the sources of resistance to this ideology?
Okay, so I focus in my analysis on 4 countries. So obviously the United States, we can't not talk about the United States, but the discussions about that gets quite parochial. We end up having facile arguments about, well, are they motivated by status anxiety, meaning racism, or are they motivated by economic anxiety, meaning class? Totally futile, sterile arguments. But then I thought, no, we need to get out of Europe, because a lot of this stuff is coming from the global south. And in fact, the global south countries are often real innovators in this, certainly India. So I focus on India, the Philippines, and Brazil, in addition to America. And looking at that sort of comparison for the largest population countries in the world, with very different historical backgrounds, very different political cultures, very different religious cultures, one of the things you find is that this mode of politics, probably you could trace it back to the Gujarat pogrom in India 2002, where essentially what had happened was that the hard right Hindu nationalist government, the BJP, was heading towards an electoral disaster. They had badly mishandled a catastrophe the previous year, an earthquake, and everybody hated them for it, and they were going to lose the elections. And instead, what they did was they instigated a pogrom against Muslims, who they said, wrongly, and probably knowingly wrongly, had started a fire on a train that had killed a number of Hindu pilgrims. And they incited against these local Muslim residents, and BJP officials, local businessmen and police collaborated with them in hunting down Muslims, beating, torturing, and killing them, raping them, murdering their children in front of them, raping and murdering their children in front of them. And what happened afterwards was, instead of this being a source of shame and off-putting for people, why would we ever vote for the BJP after this? It drove their vote up by 5%, and that vote went up most in the areas where there'd been most violence. So they established something that's really quite important for today's far right, which is that violence is no longer an electoral disadvantage. It's now a unique selling point. And another point that's quite interesting is that across the whole range of things, part of the sell is a willingness to evoke the legacy of traditional fascism. It's not concealed this. When you've got people like Elon Musk, Steve Bannon doing Sieg Heil in front of a mass audience, it's not like anybody's in any real doubt that that's what they were doing. When you've got in Italy, the Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy, with an open fascist heritage and constantly gesturing towards that fascist heritage, when you've got Rodrigo Duterte talking about how Hitler killed so many millions of Jews and I'm going to kill that many million drug addicts, and Bolsonaro evoking the dictatorship and saying we need a military dictatorship again, and having been involved in an attempted coup, you see that part of what's going on here, apart from a general sense that the far right thrives on trolling and on kind of sadistic provocation of liberals, that part of the general gesture here is to say we have been repressed for too long by the liberal superego. We've been denied options by the liberal superego and by the idea of fascism being beyond the pale. So what we're going to do is jokingly, ironically, normalize it. And of course, the irony offers you a means of psychological equivocation, which makes the ideas more acceptable. So once you sort of look at it in a sort of transnational formation, it becomes less about these, certainly race, white supremacy, this matters, but that's much more of an issue in North America and Europe. you also notice that the issue of globalization that we think is so very important if we just look at America isn't at all important in India or the Philippines or Brazil. Like, the critique of globalization that comes from Trump is not shared by these far-right leaders of the global south. And in fact, Duterte was strongly critical of protectionism. Bolsonaro is an extreme economic liberal. The same thing with Javier Milei. What's really happening there is that a lot of what we think of as being essential to this form of politics, protectionism, let's go back to the good old days, nostalgia, all that kind of stuff, that's really something to do with relative imperial decline in the global north. That's something to do with the fact that America has, though still by far the most powerful state, has been losing relative dominance, relative advantage. And Trump and his advisors can all see the direction in which it's going, and they have their particular answer to that. But that is not the attitude in India or the Philippines or Brazil. In fact, the attitude is we need to open up. We need to globalize harder. We need to turn the nation into a bundle of investment capacities to be exploited. So there's a kind of fusion between hypernationalism and hypercapitalism. And so once you go beyond the traditional readouts of the United States or Britain or wherever, you get a sense of what's really important and what's really universal about this. Another thing, by the way, that's universal is the obsession with sexuality, with masculinist solutions, with, ideas of extreme sexual evil. In India, they have the idea of the Romeo jihad. That is the idea that young Muslim men intentionally go out to woo and seduce Hindu girls to convert them as part of a spiritual war on the Hindu nation. But this is general. This is across the board. So, and that's kind of an understudied aspect of this, I would say. It's not like people have centered the idea of sexuality being a critical issue here, but you can't get around it. And it's not just when you're talking about the incels, although that is a very important part of this. And it's not just about pro-natalist politics and the demographic discourse and abortion and all the rest of it. It seeps into everything.
Richard, in North America and Europe, it seems that a sizable number of liberal pundits are happy to sheet home the blame for incipient fascisms to the white working class. Can you speak to why that's the case? Because at the same time, it seems that the working class is kind of largely absent, or has been absent, among social democratic parties for several decades. So why has this emerged, and what does it say about the social base, if there is one, in its class dimensions for the support that's been given to, or the ways in which disaster nationalism attracts particular classes?
Sure. So this argument could only possibly work in Europe and North America. If you go to the Philippines, the strongest class support for Duterte came from the middle class and the bourgeoisie. He did also get some strong support from the poor, and certainly built that support precisely through the authoritarian violence that he unleashed. But it started in the middle class. Same in Brazil and Bolsonaro, it was the established middle class that was the bedrock of his support. Actually, if you look at what happened in the United States, we can break this down. The white working class, this discourse is predicated on the idea that Trump swung a lot of counties that had previously voted for Obama. And these were Rust Belt counties. And then also that he won over a surprisingly large share of union households. Now, there's a number of problems here. First of all, when you look at what happened with union households, we're talking about the 2016 election here. What happened with union households was that not that a substantially larger number of them voted Republican, but that a huge number of those who were going to vote Democrat or who had previously voted Democrat just didn't bother turning out. So there was a collapse in Democratic support rather than there being a surge in Republican working class support on that front. And then it's the same thing when you look at the swing against the Democrats in these Rust Belt counties. If you go to Wisconsin, if you go to Michigan, what you don't find is a massive surge of voting for Donald Trump in 2016. What you do find is a collapse in turnout for the Democrats. Quite unsurprisingly, given the campaign that they ran. With that said, it remains the case that a number of working class voters did swing behind Trump, adding to the traditional Republican base, which is strongly centered on the sort of new middle class and sort of affluent suburbanites and what have you. And so there is a section of the working class that I would say is downwardly mobile, that has lost its economic and political power insofar as it ever had any, and that is much more likely to be won over to forms of resentful nationalism than other sectors of the working class. So that's a part of it. But then there's another aspect of this discourse. When people talk about the white working class, the operative term is white. What I mean by that is that they're not really talking about the working class as it's historically been understood. They're certainly not talking about the labor movement. They're not talking about people in their capacity as working class people. What they're saying is that historically, if you were white, that gave you a certain stake in society, a certain position of respect and acceptance and privilege. Privilege is the wrong word for it, but you can infer what I mean. And that has been lost. And now, so the argument goes, because of these anti-racist movements and woke culture and the government's desperate willingness to bend itself over backwards to extend respect and recognition to minorities, now these white working class people no longer have any stake in the system. They're excluded, they're marginalized, they're left behind. So this is really an argument about race and the way in which race can be used to assimilate a chunk of working class people into the system to stabilize it and form the basis for a kind of nationalist conservatism. Now, there may be, just in sort of material terms, there may be aspects of truth in this analysis, in as much as the wages of whiteness, as David Roediger would put it, have clearly declined, as they should. The wages of whiteness are declining very substantially because of successful anti-racist movements. There are still very significant areas where there are great racial disparities, but what's striking about, say, for example, a country like the United States, the biggest wages of whiteness go to the bourgeoisie. If you're rich and white, you have much more of an advantage over comparable black sort of demographics than if you're poor and white. And if you're poor and white, you're much more likely to experience the kinds of things that are associated with racialization, like extreme police violence, like locking up, cartelization, like pathologization by mental health institutions and what have you, like unemployment, poverty, homelessness, all of that sort of stuff. So at the bottom of the society, the wages of whiteness have been declining, and that is a problem for conservatives and for the new far right. Now, for the left, it could be an opportunity to say, look, just forget about the wages of whiteness. Let's build something together. Let's unite the working class in all its dimensions, across race, gender, religion, ethnicity, all of that sort of stuff. Let's build a working class movement that can retake some power and wealth from these guys who've been taking it from us for decades. Obviously, when they talk about the white working class, there's a counterinsurgent, counter-subversive thrust to that. They do not want that leftist project to succeed. And the final thing I'll say about this is there is an argument that, for example, the discourse about communism, Biden's a communist, Obama's a communist, socialists and what have you. Jeremy Corbyn even was an Eastern Bloc spy. All of this hallucinatory conspiracism. There's an argument that this stuff is basically just a kind of sublimated racism or a concealment or cover-up for racism. I'm going to suggest to you that it's actually the other way around, that one of the historical functions of racism is to develop a rationale for working class people why they should not act in their own interests. Hitler, when he addressed the German workers, he said, you shouldn't try and take over the means of production because you wouldn't know what to do with it. And all the wealth that you thought was going for you would end up going to Jewish manipulators and paymasters. That was his argument. So the argument is that you should stay within the current system and you should obey your masters, and we, the Nazis, will make sure you're treated all right. I mean, couldn't be more clearly counter-subversive politics. And I think that's essentially what this myth theme of the white working class is really about. So if we're serious about resisting fascism, as I think you asked a moment ago, what do we do to resist? If we're serious about resisting fascism, I think one of the things we have to do is drop the idea that this is about the left behinds and all the rest of it, that that's where this is coming from. Because what that leads to is an idea that, well, if we start to use some of that language and if we kind of try to appropriate some of the far right's ideas, then we can domesticate them and we can appeal to those sort of melancholic sectors of the working class and we can achieve some mild social reforms in that way. And that's not going to work. Their demographics are not going to be your demographics. And also it's going to lead you to basically be an accomplice and stooge of reaction. It also isn't going to work simply to talk about we can avoid talking about race, we can avoid talking about gender, let's just talk about core bread and butter concerns. Look, we all love bread and butter. Bread and butter is great. We need bread and butter. But it's not why we do things. You know, I mean, it's not what we love in the world, because if you think about it, the things that people love in the world, like if you have kids, there's no doubt that you really love them, but it isn't because they give you more money and energy and free time. You know, quite the opposite. It's because they need something from you. There are other human beings who need something from you. So we should think again about our politics here. This is not about bribing people with material things. Obviously, we need to improve people's living standards. Obviously, any fight that we're engaged in is about achieving that. But what draws people in is not just that. It's also a struggle for meaning, for a sense of an historical role or purpose in the world. If you look at recent examples of sort of semi-successful left-wing campaigns like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders and all the rest of them, for all their limits, one of the things they offered people was a semi-realistic chance of joining in an adventure with other people in changing the country totally. And a lot of people were up for that, a lot more people than we would have guessed. And I think that if we're going to confront this form of politics, we need to recognize that what people need more than anything is a sense of efficacy, a sense of a win, and a sense, some means of overcoming the ingrained pessimism and nihilism of contemporary capitalist culture, where everybody is just a competitor. Everybody else is a risk to be managed. Anybody might be the one to stick the knife in. And any appeal to, public interest, let alone love, is some sort of cynical ploy. We need to give people the chance to experience what it's really like when people get together to change the country or to change the world together and actually achieve something on the way. And we need to give people a chance to come to need one another. And in that process, also come to need something that Marx referred to as universality, but which we may as well call communism.
Well, Richard, we'll leave it there on that slightly hopeful note. Thanks so much for joining us. The book is Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization. It's available through Verso. You are also speaking tonight at 7 o'clock at the University of Melbourne with friend of the show, Jeff Sparrow. Tickets may or may not be available, so have a look. And if people want to find you on Blue Sky, you are at Leninology. Thanks for coming on.
All right, brilliant. Thank you for having me.
Well, Andy, that is our program. We'll be back next week. See you then.
We will. See you then.
Under the island, middle of a mountain, there is a big Join coastal communities of Western Victoria for the Seismic Shift, a powerful event to stop seismic blasting, a deadly practice that is killing marine life in the search for offshore gas and oil. Enjoy live performances by Leah Senior and Daniel Aaron, inspiring speakers and a massive group action. Saturday the 29th of March, Logan's Beach, Warrnambool, 1 to 5 p.m. Family friendly. Go to ocean.org.au for your free ticket. A 3CR supporter.
CR's Trans Day of Audibility returns for its 4th year running, Sunday the 30th of March. Tune in from 12 noon to catch 6 hours of transgender voices, including musical performances from Race Rage and Shirker. Trans Day of Audibility, a day for us to be heard and not seen. 12 to 6 p.m, Sunday the 30th of March on 3CR.